The morning of May 29, 1945, dawned clear over Yokohama Bay. The air held that electric tension that comes before thunder. Then it began, a low rumble from the east, growing louder, deeper, more menacing with each passing second. 517 American B-29 superfortresses filled the sky. Their massive silver wings caught the morning light. 4 Wright R-3350 engines on each bomber created a sound like the world ending. The formation stretched for miles, a river of aluminum death flowing toward Japan. Beside them flew their escorts, 101 P-51 Mustangs, sleek fighters with their distinctive bubble canopies. Their Merlin engines sang a different tune, higher-pitched, more urgent, like hunting wolves flanking a herd of elephants. From airfields across Japan came the response. 150 Zero fighters climbed desperately toward the incoming armada. Their Sakai engines screamed at full power. Propellers clawed at thin air. Pilots pushed their controls forward with grim determination. The Zeros looked fragile next to the massive bombers, like dragonflies attacking eagles. Their once proud silhouettes seemed almost pathetic against the American formation. The legendary fighters that had ruled these skies just 3 years earlier now appeared hopelessly outmatched. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. American gunners opened fire first. Streams of tracers laced the sky. The P-51 escorts dove into the Japanese formation with devastating effect. Their 650 caliber machine guns chattered death. The sound was like cloth tearing. Loud enough to be heard over engine noise, 5 B-29s fell that day, their crews tumbling toward Earth in burning aluminum coffins. Another 175 limped home with holes punched through their fuselages. But the cost to Japan was catastrophic. The mathematics were undeniable, brutal, final. By evening, the legendary Zero had become prey instead of predator. The terror of the Pacific skies was now just another target for American guns. In a cramped engineering office in war-torn Nagoya, one man absorbed these reports with the heavy heart of someone who understood their true meaning. Jiro Horikoshi sat at his desk surrounded by technical drawings and battle damage reports. His shoulders sagged under invisible weight. The brilliant mind behind the Zero fighter was confronting a truth that military pride had refused to acknowledge for months. The aircraft he had poured his genius into was now hopelessly outclassed. The machine that had once seemed invincible was dying in the skies above Japan. Horikoshi stared at the numbers on his desk. Kill ratios, performance comparisons, production figures. Every statistic told the same story. His creation had become obsolete. American engineering had surpassed everything Japan could produce. This is how the myth of Japanese air superiority finally crumbled. How the engineers who built that myth came to understand their creation's fatal limitations. To grasp how far the Zero had fallen by 1945, we must first understand how high it had once soared. The year was 1937. Imperial Japan was expanding its reach across Asia with ruthless efficiency. The Japanese Navy faced a unique challenge. They needed a fighter that could escort bombers on 1,000-mile missions over the vast Pacific. Yet it still had to outfight any enemy aircraft it encountered. The specifications seemed impossible. Western engineers would have laughed at such demands. Speed, maneuverability, firepower, and incredible range. All in a carrier-based fighter. All in one aircraft. Enter Jiro Horikoshi, a 34-year-old aeronautical engineer at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Horikoshi had graduated from the newly established aviation laboratory within the engineering department of the University of Tokyo. He started his career at Mitsubishi Internal Combustion Engine Company Limited. The company later became Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Nagoya Aircraft Manufacturing Plant. Horikoshi faced an engineering challenge that seemed to defy physics, but he had a different philosophy from Western designers: absolute weight reduction. Every gram mattered. Every component had to justify its existence. Horikoshi and his team began working on the aircraft in October 1937. They knew that making the fighter as lightweight as possible would benefit both maneuverability and range. The approach was revolutionary, also dangerous. Every rivet underwent scrutiny. Every structural component was analyzed for weight savings. Japanese metallurgists developed new aluminum alloys specifically for the project. Engineers eliminated armor plating completely. Fuel tank protection was sacrificed. These decisions would prove catastrophic later, but they gave the Zero its initial devastating edge. The gross weight of the A6M Zero was 5,815 pounds. This was 1,811 pounds less than its primary adversary in spring 1942. The Grumman F4F4 Wildcat weighed 7,126 pounds. The difference was enormous in aviation terms. When the Zero first appeared over China in 1940, it was a revelation. Chinese pilots flying obsolete aircraft fell before it, like wheat before a scythe. The Japanese fighter seemed to move through air like it was designed by physics itself. Combat trials began in China during July 1940. By fall, Zero pilots had downed nearly 100 Chinese aircraft. They lost only 2 Zeros to friendly fire. The performance was unprecedented in aviation warfare. The aircraft that emerged from Horikoshi's drawing boards defied Western expectations completely. The Zero first flew in 1939. It was exceedingly agile and lightweight. Its maneuverability and range were superior to any other fighter in the world at that time. It could turn tighter than any Allied fighter. The turning radius was impossibly small. It could climb faster than most contemporary aircraft. Most remarkably, it could fly over 1,900 miles on a single tank of fuel. This range was unheard of for a fighter aircraft. American intelligence dismissed early reports of the Zero's performance as impossible. Claire Lee Chennault led the Flying Tigers in China. He wrote detailed reports about the Zero's capabilities to his home country. The reports were comprehensive and accurate. However, United States Department of War analysts rejected Chennault's report as erroneous nonsense. They concluded the performance attributed to the Zero was an aerodynamic impossibility. Western engineers simply couldn't believe such performance was achievable. That dismissive attitude would cost countless Allied lives in the coming months. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Japanese naval aviators flew 328 combat-ready A6M Zero fighters against American forces at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines. The attack was devastating, methodical, overwhelming. The Zero's legend was born in fire and smoke over the burning American fleet. For thousands of Allied airmen, the most terrifying sight they ever saw was a Mitsubishi A6M Zero bearing down on them. The distinctive silhouette meant death. Burnished black cowling covered a snarling sockeye engine. Staccato bursts flashed from 2 machine guns and 2 cannons. The sound was distinctive, terrifying. Often the last thing Allied pilots ever heard. For 6 months, the Zero ruled the Pacific skies absolutely. It outclassed every Allied fighter it encountered. The dominance was complete, overwhelming, seemingly permanent. British Spitfires fell before it. American Wildcats were outmaneuvered. Dutch Brewster Buffaloes were sitting ducks. All fell before the Zero's superior maneuverability and range. Even the contemporary models of the famous British Spitfire and Hurricane fighters had major problems with the Zero when they met in 1942. In those early months, the Zero achieved something unprecedented in aviation warfare. It maintained an outstanding kill ratio of 12-1. 12 Allied aircraft destroyed for every Zero lost. The numbers were staggering. It seemed unstoppable, invincible, destined to rule the Pacific skies forever. But empires built on technological superiority are fragile things. The first crack in the Zero's invincibility appeared in an unlikely place. A soggy patch of tundra on Akutan Island in the Aleutians, June 4, 1942. During the Japanese attack on Dutch Harbor, Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's Zero took anti-aircraft fire. Black smoke poured from his engine. Oil spattered across his windscreen. The regulation gray paint and bright red Hinamaru emblem were being obscured by mechanical failure. Koga lowered his landing gear over Akutan Island. The terrain looked solid from altitude. Tall grass stretched across what appeared to be firm ground, but appearances were deceiving. The wheels dug into what turned out to be tall grass, concealing 2 feet of standing water. The Zero slammed to a stop as the propeller dug into soft tundra. The aircraft flipped onto its back with violent force. Koga died instantly from the impact, but his aircraft remained virtually intact. This would change the course of the war. 5 weeks later, American salvage crews discovered the overturned Zero. The plane's landing gear was mired in water and mud. The crash had caused the aircraft to flip upside down and skid to a stop. Although the aircraft survived the landing nearly intact, Petty Officer Koga died instantly on impact, probably from a broken neck or blunt force trauma to his head. What the Americans found when they righted that Zero and flew it for the first time sent shockwaves through Allied aviation circles. Every secret was revealed, every advantage exposed, every weakness laid bare. Flight tests of the intact Zero confirmed what was already known by those who had fought against it. The Zero was fast, agile, and unbeatable in low-altitude climbs. Mitsubishi had achieved all this with an engine generating a mere 1,000 horsepower. But the tests also revealed the Zero's fatal weakness. The design had sacrificed weight and protection for both pilot and aircraft. The aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific was built like origami, in the words of one American pilot. One well-placed burst could turn it into a fireball. The fuel tanks had no self-sealing capability. A single tracer round could ignite the entire aircraft. The pilot had no armor protection whatsoever. The engine lacked protective plating. Max Hastings observed about a recovered Zero wreck. This gives you a very clear idea of why the Allies came to call this the origami aircraft or the paper aircraft. You can see very clearly that although this was an amazing aircraft when it was intact, it was also an incredibly fragile one. It did not take much to shoot it out of the sky if you hit it. While American engineers studied every rivet of the captured Zero, a different aircraft was taking shape in California, one that would prove to be the Zero's nemesis. The design philosophy was completely different. The North American P-51 Mustang had an unusual genesis. Originally built for the British Royal Air Force in 1940, it was designed in just 117 days. But early versions powered by Allison engines were disappointing at high altitude. Performance above 15,000 feet was inadequate for European combat. It wasn't until the aircraft was mated with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that the Mustang revealed its true potential. The same power plant that gave the Spitfire its legendary performance transformed the Mustang into a world beater. The P-51 was designed as a mass-produced long-range escort fighter. It mounted a 1,590 horsepower Packard V1650 Merlin liquid-cooled inline piston engine. This drove a four-bladed propeller unit at the nose. The power difference was enormous compared to Japanese fighters. Where the Zero achieved its range through weight reduction and a fuel-efficient radial engine, the Mustang accomplished it through superior aerodynamics and internal fuel capacity, plus the ability to carry external drop tanks. The contrast in design philosophy was stark. The P-51 had much longer range thanks to its drop tanks. This allowed it to accompany bombers on their missions and provide protection for extended periods. The P-51 could easily fly 1,550 miles on internal fuel alone. Its range could be increased to over 2,000 miles with external tanks. But it was the Mustang's combat capabilities that would prove devastating to Japanese aviation. The P-51 Mustang was armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns. This gave it superior firepower and accuracy compared to any Japanese fighter. The Mustang's armament made it a deadly opponent for enemy aircraft and ground targets alike. Against the Zero's pair of 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, the Mustang's concentrated firepower was overwhelming. The rate of fire was much higher. The ammunition capacity was greater. More importantly, the Mustang was fast, really fast. With a top speed exceeding 430 miles per hour at altitude, it could outrun any Zero variant ever built. Speed was life in aerial combat. The P-51 weighed significantly more than an A6M Zero, about 7,600 pounds for the P-51 versus about 5,300 pounds for the A6M. It had considerably more power. The P-51's 1,750 horsepower V12 engine dwarfed the A6M's 940 horsepower 14-cylinder radial engine, and it was much faster. 406 miles per hour for the P-51 versus 352 miles per hour for the A6M. By 1943, the writing was on the wall for anyone who cared to read it. The Zero's early victories had been built on superior training, surprise, and the inadequacy of early Allied fighters. But America's industrial might was awakening. With it came a new generation of fighters that made the Zero's advantages irrelevant. The F-6F Hellcat entered combat in August 1943. It was powered by a massive 2,000-horsepower radial engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was a monster power plant. It dwarfed anything Japan could produce. The Hellcat's top speed of around 380 miles per hour outpaced the Zero at optimum altitude. The Hellcat's 37,000-foot service ceiling also translated into an operational altitude advantage. Above 10,000 feet, the F-6F climbed as quickly as the lightweight Zero. More devastating still, unlike the Zero, the Hellcat was fortified with 200 pounds of armor plating around the cockpit. The windscreen was made of bulletproof plexiglass. More armor protected vital engine components. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. The contrast was stark. The tide was turning, and Japanese engineers knew it. Navy General Staff at Rabaul conferred in the later months of 1943 on naval fighter aircraft. They broached the topic of providing bullet protection for the Zero fighter. The strategic outlook for Japan had switched from offensive to defensive. Navy staff still considered the Zero to be the best fighter in the theater, though they conceded that the Corsair, with its great horizontal speed, was a match for their fighter. But there was a deeper problem, one that would prove fatal. Japan simply couldn't match American production capacity. Japan produced only 11,000 Zero fighters during the entire war. Their American counterparts produced nearly 300,000 aircraft total. The numbers were overwhelming, crushing, impossible to overcome. Even worse, Japan was losing its most precious resource: experienced pilots. The Zero's non-existent armor protection and loss of entire aircraft carriers took a heavy toll on Japanese aviators. This eroded their experience advantage rapidly. The Zero's lack of protection, once justified by performance gains, was now a death sentence. Japan's rapidly dwindling pool of skilled pilots was being consumed by American firepower. Each loss was irreplaceable. The P-51 was a relative latecomer to the Pacific theater. This was due largely to the need for the aircraft in Europe. The first P-51s were deployed in the Far East later in 1944. They operated in close support and escort missions, as well as tactical photo reconnaissance. But when the Mustang finally arrived in the Pacific theater in significant numbers, it brought capabilities that the Zero simply could not match. The psychological impact was devastating. With the capture of Iwo Jima, USAF P-51 Mustang fighters of the 7th Fighter Command were stationed on that island starting in March 1945. They were initially tasked with escorting Boeing B-29 Superfortress missions against the Japanese mainland. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. Here was an American fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Japan, fight its way through Japanese interceptors, and still have fuel to return to base safely. The Zero's greatest advantage, its extraordinary range, was no longer unique. American engineering had matched and exceeded it. More devastating still, the Mustang could fight at altitudes where the Zero struggled. While the Zero could usually outmaneuver other Allied fighters at low speeds, it could not maneuver as well at high speeds. Combined with its lower performance at high speeds, its inferior flight ceiling, poor diving and climbing ability, and mostly non-existent radio and armor, you had an aircraft that most Allied fighters were eager to encounter. American pilots had learned harsh lessons in the early war years. They applied those lessons with devastating effect. Smart P-51 pilots would boom and zoom the Zero, striking in a dive and climbing again for another attack run. A master pilot like Sakai or Nishizawa was still dangerous in a Zero, but equally skilled matchups between Zeros and Mustangs were bad deals for the Japanese. Unless the American pilot played to the Zero's strengths by getting into a turning fight. By late 1944, the mathematical certainty of Japan's defeat was becoming apparent. Anyone willing to examine the numbers could see the truth. In the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot over the Philippine Sea, Allied fighters and flak gunners shot down over 500 Japanese warplanes. They lost just 123 USN aircraft in return. The Zero was still in production. Indeed, it would continue to be manufactured until the very end of the war, but not because it was still competitive. Shortages of high-powered aviation engines and problems with planned successor models meant the Zero remained in production. The superior Mitsubishi A6M Zero was planned as the Zero's replacement. But development problems and resource shortages meant the Zero stayed on production lines until 1945. Over 10,000 of all variants were produced. Japan's aviation industry had plans for better fighters. The Kawanishi N1K Shiden, the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, the A7M Repu. But time and resources were running out rapidly. The Japanese waited too long to develop and produce these advanced fighters. It didn't help that Japan, a small island nation with limited engineering and manufacturing manpower, spent time developing more than 90 major combat aircraft types, plus several dozen lesser models. Resources were scattered across too many projects. Meanwhile, American bombers were systematically destroying Japan's aviation industry. The strategic bombing campaign was methodical and devastating. On December 12, 1944, a powerful earthquake in the Tokai region forced Mitsubishi to halt aircraft production at its plant in Omachi, Nagoya. An air raid by B-29s on the Mitsubishi engine works in Daikocho, Nagoya, a week later, caused extensive damage. Production suffered severe setbacks. Jiro Horikoshi himself was experiencing the collapse firsthand. Horikoshi had been at a conference in Tokyo with Imperial Navy officers. They were discussing the new Repu fighter program. He returned to Nagoya on December 17th, just in time to experience another air raid on the Mitsubishi factories the next day. Exhausted and overworked, Horikoshi fell ill with pleurisy on December 25th. He remained bedridden through early April 1945. The man who had created Japan's greatest fighter was watching his life's work crumble. American industrial superiority and technological advancement were overwhelming everything he had built. As 1945 dawned, the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific skies, had become a liability. A few years after its legendary victories, the Zero fighter was being used in the Japanese kamikaze campaign. It was now regarded as a virtually useless aircraft in conventional combat. The reasons were stark and mathematical. Added to this was the generally abysmal quality control of late-war Japanese manufacturing. Attendant unreliability meant the Japanese were facing impossible odds. Japan's war economy was collapsing. With it went the quality of Zeros rolling off production lines. Materials were substandard. Workmanship was rushed. Quality control was non-existent. The aircraft that had once been precision instruments were now barely airworthy. But perhaps most telling was the simple question of pilot survival. Could a Zero fighter hope to hold its own against a P-51 Mustang in a one-on-one engagement? Only if there was an ace pilot flying it. With roughly similar pilot skill levels, the Zero did not have much chance. Even the greatest of Japan's aces understood the mathematical reality. Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's greatest aces. He loved the Zero fighter, but he was wounded over Guadalcanal in 1942. The aircraft that had made him famous was now a death trap for novice pilots. He knew this better than anyone. The myth of Zero invincibility was dead. What remained was the painful acknowledgement of harsh truth. American engineering had evolved beyond Japan's ability to compete. In the bombed-out factories of Nagoya, the reality was inescapable. In the desperate conferences of Navy staff, the numbers told their story. In the increasingly futile sorties over the home islands, the same realization was dawning. Engineers understood first. Then pilots began to admit it. Finally, commanders faced the truth. The Zero was finished as an effective fighting machine. The question wasn't whether Japanese aviation professionals would admit this reality. The question was how long they could afford to ignore it. As we'll see, that admission would come in the most dramatic way possible. Through the final desperate battles over Japan itself, the Zero's obsolescence would be written in fire across the skies of the dying empire. April 1945 arrived like a hammer blow to Japan. The war had come home with a vengeance that few could have imagined 4 years earlier. American B-29 superfortresses appeared over Japanese cities like harbingers of apocalypse. Their aluminum hulls gleamed in the sun as they methodically reduced Japan's industrial centers to ash and rubble. The sound of their engines became the soundtrack to Japan's destruction, day after day, night after night, without pause or mercy. The engineers who had devoted their lives to building Japan's aerial might watch their world crumble. Each bombing raid struck like a personal blow. Jiro Horikoshi finally shook off the lingering effects of pleurisy. He stood surrounded by twisted metal and concrete debris. This wasteland had once housed Mitsubishi's crown jewel aircraft factory. The scene mocked everything he had achieved. The creator of the legendary Zero now witnessed American bombers overhead. Enemy fighters escorted these raiders. These escorts flew machines that surpassed anything Japan could send skyward. The harsh numbers painted a picture no propaganda could brighten. July 1945 marked the beginning of systematic destruction. 51 separate raids launched by the 7th Fighter Command carved through Japanese defenses. Their claims seemed almost modest. 162 aircraft destroyed or damaged, 254 ships left burning or broken. Countless A6M models continued rolling off production lines until the war's final hours. Most never tasted combat. They died on the ground instead. Their wings never carried them toward battle. American fighters swept down like mechanical birds of prey. Japanese pilots couldn't even reach their cockpits before death arrived from above. The assembly lines kept moving. Workers kept building. But the aircraft they crafted became elaborate coffins before they ever flew. Air-to-air combat revealed the Zero's tragic obsolescence most clearly. American aviators soared through Japanese skies with confidence their predecessors never possessed. Years of brutal combat experience shaped these pilots. Their aircraft outclassed Japanese fighters in every measurable aspect. Fear no longer gripped American hearts when Japanese fighters appeared on the horizon. The psychological warfare had completely reversed direction. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai embodied this transformation perfectly. Japan's legendary ace carried 64 confirmed victories on his record. Now he flew increasingly hopeless missions. His aircraft had become death traps for the young men under his command. The pilot who once terrorized Allied squadrons over Guadalcanal faced grim mathematical reality. Even his extraordinary skill couldn't bridge the technological canyon that separated Japanese and American aviation. Sakai's later memoirs captured the helplessness perfectly. He watched novice Japanese pilots climb into cockpits. These were boys, really. Children with perhaps 40 hours of flight training behind them. They faced veteran American pilots flying Mustangs and Hellcats. The outcome was predetermined by simple arithmetic. No amount of courage could overcome such odds. Could any Zero fighter stand against a P-51 Mustang in single combat? Only under very specific circumstances. The Mustang pilot would need to attempt low-speed dogfighting. He would need to stay mainly on the horizontal plane. Since all American pilots had received strict training against such tactics, the Zero's chances remained microscopic. The contrast in pilot preparation was absolutely staggering. Japan struggled with crippling fuel shortages. Training new pilots became nearly impossible. America's aviation schools operated like vast industrial machines. They produced thousands of well-trained airmen every month. Their assembly lines churned out pilots like Detroit manufactured automobiles. Each American carried hundreds of flight hours before seeing combat. His Japanese counterpart might possess 40 hours total when thrown into battle. The voices of engineers and designers carried special weight during these dark days. These men understood mathematics and physics intimately. They could read the future with painful clarity. The numbers spoke in a language that transcended military optimism or national pride. In the engineering offices that still functioned, Japanese aeronautical experts conducted merciless assessments. They compared their aircraft's performance against Allied fighters. The data arrived undeniable and devastating. The Zero's original advantages had transformed into irrelevant curiosities. Maneuverability and range meant nothing now. American tactical evolution had rendered these qualities meaningless. American pilots had mastered the art of exploiting their aircraft's strengths. Simultaneously, they avoided every remaining Zero advantage with surgical precision. Classic boom and zoom tactics employed by P-51 pilots made the Zero's tight turning radius completely pointless. Why engage in close dogfighting when superior alternatives existed? Dive from altitude. Fire a concentrated burst. Climb away before the Zero could even respond. The performance gap had widened into an unbridgeable chasm. The P-51 Mustang achieved 437 miles per hour in level flight. The latest Zero variant, the A6M topped out at 352 miles per hour. At combat altitudes above 20,000 feet, the difference became even more pronounced. The Merlin engine truly excelled in that thin air. The Mustang could climb to 41,900 feet. The Zero's service ceiling stopped at 38,520 feet. Raw performance numbers told only part of this tragic story. Qualitative differences proved equally damning. The P-51's 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. Each weapon could fire 850 rounds per minute. The Zero's mixed armament of machine guns and cannon seemed antiquated by comparison. More critically, the Mustang's robust construction allowed it to absorb battle damage that would obliterate a Zero completely. Japanese test pilots who flew captured Allied aircraft filed reports throughout the war. These documents read like technical obituaries for their own fighters. The captured P-51 C-11NT, marked as aircraft number 78, provided direct experience of American capabilities. This machine had belly-landed on an airfield in China. Japanese engineers gained first-hand knowledge of their enemy's technological superiority. The reports arrived sobering beyond belief. The Mustang wasn't merely faster and more heavily armed, it was also easier to fly and more forgiving of pilot errors. Inexperienced pilots could survive mistakes that would kill Zero pilots instantly. By mid-1945, the facade of Zero superiority crumbled even in official circles. No amount of propaganda could maintain the illusion any longer. Naval staff meetings that once celebrated Zero achievements now focused on damage control. Desperate expedients dominated every conversation. The discussions in those smoke-filled rooms represented collective admission. Japan's aviation industry had been decisively outclassed by American technology. The evidence surrounded them everywhere they looked. Spring 1945 brought American daylight raids over Japan with complete impunity. The last major raid of May targeted Yokohama with daylight incendiary attacks. On May 29th, 517 B-29s approached their target. 101 P-51s provided escort protection. This massive force met resistance from 150 A6M Zero fighters. The resulting air battle sparked intense aerial combat. 5 B-29s fell from the sky. Another 175 sustained damage of varying degrees. Surface analysis might suggest Japanese victory. After all, they had damaged numerous American bombers. The underlying mathematics revealed a different story entirely. Japan had committed 150 fighters against this single American formation. This represented a significant portion of their remaining operational strength. The bombers had reached their intended target successfully. They delivered their ordnance as planned. They returned home safely. The escort fighters had completed their mission perfectly. More ominously for Japan, aircraft production was collapsing under relentless Allied bombing pressure. The sophisticated industrial base that had produced over 11,000 Zeros was being systematically destroyed piece by piece. What value did brilliant aircraft designs possess when no factories remained to build them? The manufacturing infrastructure that had made the Zero possible was disappearing under tons of American explosives. For Jiro Horikoshi, this collapse represented profound personal and professional crisis. The man once hailed as a genius of aeronautical engineering now confronted the limitations of his greatest achievement. Horikoshi's personal diary entries from this period revealed a man grappling with impossible implications. These writings, published in 1956, showed his internal struggle. Despite Mitsubishi's close ties to the Japanese military establishment, Despite his direct participation in the nation's military buildup toward war, Horikoshi remained strongly opposed to what he regarded as futile conflict. The engineer who created the Zero possessed the insight to understand why it had become obsolete. The design philosophy that made the Zero revolutionary in 1940 had sealed its fate by 1945. Extreme weight reduction at the expense of protection had become a fatal flaw. The aircraft that terrorized the Pacific in the early war years had earned a new nickname from Allied pilots. They called it the origami fighter, beautiful, precise, and fatally fragile. Horikoshi and his team had recognized these shortcomings early. Work on the A6M Zero began as early as 1942. This aircraft was intended as the Zero's successor. The Zero would have addressed many of the Zero's weaknesses, but development of this fighter suffered from countless delays. By the time serious development efforts began, Japan lacked essential resources. Time had run out. Industrial capacity was crumbling. The new fighter could never be fielded in meaningful numbers. The final great air battles over Japan painted the Zero's obsolescence in stark, undeniable terms. During the war's closing months, American fighters roamed Japanese airspace with virtual impunity. P-51 Mustangs, originally designed as bomber escorts, now served as ground attack aircraft. They strafed Japanese airfields with systematic precision. They destroyed aircraft on the ground like sitting targets. They systematically dismantled what remained of Japan's once proud Air Force. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots proved devastating beyond measure. Veterans like Sakai watched squadron after squadron of young pilots take off in Zeros. They knew that most would never return home. The aircraft that had once been a pilot's best friend had transformed into a coffin with wings. Even more heartbreaking were the kamikaze missions that followed. By 1945, many Zeros served not as fighters, but as guided missiles. Their pilots received orders to crash into American ships rather than engage in conventional air-to-air combat. This desperate tactic represented the ultimate admission of the Zero's failure as a traditional fighter. If your aircraft couldn't compete in normal combat, perhaps it could serve as a weapon of absolute last resort. The mathematics of aerial warfare had shifted decisively against Japan. Fighter versus fighter encounters now favored American pilots by overwhelming margins. Experienced American pilots in Mustangs and Hellcats enjoyed kill ratios that sometimes exceeded 10-to-1. The Zero's once legendary maneuverability meant absolutely nothing when American pilots could choose when and where to fight. They dove from altitude with impunity. They fired devastating bursts. They climbed away before Japanese fighters could even begin to respond. August 15, 1945, brought Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. This announcement marked the end of Japan's aviation dreams. It signaled the beginning of painful reckoning with harsh reality. For the men who had built Japan's Air Force, defeat represented more than simple military failure. It stood as an indictment of their entire technological and industrial philosophy. The Zero, once hailed as the ultimate expression of Japanese engineering excellence, had been revealed as a magnificent dead end. Its early success had masked fundamental flaws that would prove impossible to overcome. In the months following surrender, American technical intelligence teams systematically evaluated Japanese aircraft technology. Their reports showed respect for Japanese craftsmanship and innovation. However, they remained brutally honest about the technological gap that had opened between Japan and the Allied powers. Captured Zeros, along with other Japanese fighters, were flown by American test pilots. These aviators marveled at their builders' ingenuity while noting fatal limitations. The consensus emerged clear and undeniable. Japanese aircraft design had peaked in 1941 and 42. It had failed to evolve with the demands of modern warfare. Technology had moved beyond Japanese capabilities. Jiro Horikoshi survived the war's devastation. He would enjoy a distinguished post-war career in civilian aviation. His work on the YS-11 passenger aircraft demonstrated that his engineering talents remained formidable. However, he never forgot the lessons of the Zero's rise and fall. In his post-war writings, Horikoshi remained candid about the Zero's limitations. He understood the factors that led to its obsolescence with painful clarity. The aircraft's early success had bred dangerous complacency in Japanese military circles. This success fostered belief that superior training and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Reality proved this assumption tragically wrong. The admission that the Zero had been outclassed didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it emerged through accumulated weight of battlefield evidence, technical analysis, and personal experience. By war's end, virtually every Japanese aviation professional understood the truth. Official propaganda maintained the fiction of Japanese air superiority until the very last day. But the professionals knew better. They had seen the evidence with their own eyes. Historical accounts suggest that Japanese historian and JASDF Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya made a telling statement. He declared that acquisition of the A6M Zero was no less serious than the Japanese defeat at the Battle of Midway. It did much to hasten Japan's final defeat. The story of the Zero's defeat by the Mustang ultimately told a larger story about accelerated technological warfare. In just 4 years, aviation technology had advanced more rapidly than in the previous 2 decades combined. The Americans had absorbed bitter lessons from early encounters with the Zero. They applied those lessons with devastating effectiveness throughout the conflict. The F-6F Hellcat represented the first direct response to Japanese design philosophy. This aircraft was developed with knowledge gained from the captured A6M Zero. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the Hellcat was built like a flying tank. Where the Zero relied on pilot skill and maneuverability, the Hellcat used raw power and superior firepower to achieve victory. The P-51 Mustang represented an even more sophisticated evolutionary step. Its combination of long range, high speed, powerful armament, and robust construction made it the ultimate expression of American aviation technology. Most importantly, it could be mass-produced in quantities that Japan could never hope to match. The production numbers told their own devastating story. America built over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs during the war's duration. Japan produced just over 11,000 Zeros of all variants combined. American industry wasn't merely building better aircraft, it was building more of them, faster, with superior quality control and better materials throughout. As smoke cleared over Japan's devastated cities, as the wreckage of the Imperial Navy's air arm was tallied, the lessons of the Zero's defeat became clear to all who cared to examine them. Superior technology backed by overwhelming industrial capacity had proven decisive in modern warfare. The romantic notion that individual skill and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages had been conclusively disproven. The Zero's early victories had been built on technological superiority. When that superiority was lost, defeat followed inevitably. For Jiro Horikoshi and his fellow engineers, the experience proved both humbling and educational. They had created a magnificent aircraft that briefly dominated the skies. However, they had failed to anticipate the rapid pace of technological evolution in wartime conditions. The Zero's design philosophy represented extreme specialization at the expense of adaptability. This approach had proven to be a fatal flaw. The admission that the Zero was outclassed by aircraft, like the P-51 Mustang, wasn't just a technical acknowledgement. It represented recognition that Japan's entire approach to aviation warfare had been fundamentally flawed. The emphasis on individual aircraft performance over industrial capacity had proven disastrous. The belief that quality could substitute for quantity had been thoroughly debunked. The assumption that early technological advantages would prove permanent had been shattered by American industrial might. Perhaps most importantly, the Zero's story demonstrated the dangers of military complacency. The aircraft's early success had bred overconfidence that blinded Japanese planners to the need for continuous technological evolution. While American engineers were already working on Zero successors in 1942, Japan continued relying on incremental improvements to an increasingly obsolete design. The final irony was that the Zero's greatest strength had become its greatest weakness. Its extreme optimization for specific mission requirements had trapped its designers. In a rapidly evolving technological environment, adaptability mattered more than perfection. The Americans understood this principle instinctively. They built aircraft that could evolve and improve throughout the war's duration. The Japanese, committed to the perfect expression of their original concept, found themselves trapped by their own success. They had created a masterpiece for 1941 conditions. Those conditions had changed completely by 1945. Today, aviation historians and engineers study the Zero's rise and fall as a classic example of technological warfare dynamics. They examine how technological superiority can be both won and lost with startling rapidity. The aircraft that once seemed invincible was ultimately defeated not by a single superior opponent. Instead, an entire system of industrial and technological development outpaced Japan's ability to compete. The Japanese engineers' admission that the Zero was outclassed was more than a technical assessment. It represented recognition that the future of warfare belonged to nations capable of sustaining technological innovation on an industrial scale. In that contest, Japan's magnificent craftsmanship and engineering skill were no match for America's industrial might and systematic approach to technological development. The Zero's legacy remains complex and multifaceted. It stands as a testament to human ingenuity and design excellence. Simultaneously, it serves as a warning about the dangers of technological stagnation in an era of rapid change. For the men who built it, flew it, and ultimately saw it defeated, the Zero represented both their greatest triumph and their most painful lesson in the realities of modern warfare. In the end, the admission that the Zero was outclassed was not a moment of defeat. It was a moment of truth. A recognition that in the harsh algebra of technological warfare, being very good at what you did yesterday was insufficient to survive what your enemies might do tomorrow. As Jiro Horikoshi himself would later reflect, the Zero's story was ultimately Japan's story in miniature. A brilliant early success, undone by an inability to adapt to a changing world. The aircraft that had seemed to embody Japanese technological prowess had instead revealed its limitations. These limitations would echo through Japan's post-war efforts to rebuild and modernize its industrial base. The Zero was outclassed not because it was poorly designed. It failed because the world of aviation warfare had moved beyond the principles that had made it great. In acknowledging this truth, Japanese engineers began the long process of understanding how to compete in the modern world. This lesson would prove invaluable in Japan's remarkable post-war economic recovery. The story of the Zero and the Mustang was ultimately about more than just aircraft. It described the collision between two different approaches to technology, warfare, and industrial development. The Japanese approach emphasized perfection, craftsmanship, and spiritual dedication. This philosophy had produced a magnificent aircraft that dominated the early war years. The American approach emphasized adaptability, mass production, and continuous improvement. This methodology ultimately proved more sustainable in prolonged conflict. For those who lived through this transformation, the lessons were both painful and permanent. The admission that the Zero was outclassed marked not just the end of Japanese air superiority. It signaled the beginning of new understanding about how technology, industry, and warfare would interact in the modern world. It was a lesson written in fire across Pacific skies. It was paid for in blood by pilots who flew these magnificent and ultimately tragic machines. It was remembered by the engineers who created them as both their greatest achievement and their most profound failure.